Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Bertemu lagi kita dalam satu lagi siri yang kami bawakan dari World Urban Forum ke-12 yang berlangsung di Kaherah ini telah pun menutup tirainya dan sudah pasti perkongsian ini signifikan untuk kita kongsikan bersama. Dan pastinya hal-hal berkaitan dengan perbandaran dan khususnya perumahan menjadi tema. Tetapi apalah maknanya forum ini tanpa melihat dan juga berdiskusi mengenai krisis kemanusiaan yang terbesar berlaku di Gaza khususnya. Saya berkesempatan menemui Profesor Dr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. Beliau merupakan profesor di MIT Amerika Syarikat dan juga merupakan perutusan khas PBB berkaitan dengan isu perumahan yang adil. Dan dalam interview ataupun dalam temu bual tersebut, kami berbincang mengenai banyak perkara. Salah satunya ialah bagaimana kita melihat isu yang berlaku di Gaza kali ini ataupun pada hari ini adalah satu bentuk penindasan secara besar-besaran khususnya terhadap penempatan manusia, dan itu merupakan hak asasi manusia yang paling asas sekali. Kita dengarkan sedikit temu bual saya bersama dengan beliau.
Yes, unfortunately, mass destruction of housing is increasingly part of modern warfare these days. You see it in all modern conflicts. You saw it in the bombing of Iraq in 2003 and 4, the total destruction of Fallujah. You saw it in the destruction of Syria during the Syrian civil war. The complete is still happening. The utter destruction of homes and Aleppo, cities like that. You also saw, of course, the destruction of Mariupol and many other cities in Ukraine by Russia. And of course, most tragically now, we have seen the complete destruction, the utter leveling of Gaza because of the wars since last October. And now the war is spreading to Lebanon, for example, where many southern villages have been completely leveled as well. And this is exactly what I've been describing as domicide. The mass destruction of housing in conflict, which I believe should be treated as criminal under international law, should be prosecuted as not just a war crime but as a crime against humanity. And I'm actually advocating before states, including in my report to the UN General Assembly, that states actually prosecute and prevent such acts from taking place.
But it seems like nothing happened, even though the ICJ and the ICC give the judgment about what happened in Gaza, but there's nothing that can stop Israel to doing what happening now.
Yes, unfortunately, the international community is failing. In fact, the international order is teetering on a knife's edge right now. We have to re-establish rule of law in international affairs. No country is above the law, and that includes Israel. The General Assembly has tried to follow up the ICJ ruling by ordering that the occupation must end within 1 year exactly. And we hope to see in the UN system further steps that are taken individually by each state, because each state is under an obligation to carry out the ICJ order. And also we hope to see actions at the UN level. For example, I've been advocating for a while that following the precedent the General Assembly set in 1974 when it suspended, or rather unseated, South Africa from the UN. It was not seated again until apartheid ended in 1994. I've been advocating that Israel should be unseated for its persistent and continuing violations of international law. And it refuses to comply, and the ongoing violations in Gaza and spreading across the region show that Israel is a threat to international peace and security, and it must be actually held accountable.
Profesor Balakrishnan secara jelas mengatakan bahawa apa yang berlaku di Gaza adalah satu jenayah peperangan besar-besaran, kerana bukan sahaja kerana atas mempertahankan diri oleh Israel, tetapi juga ianya adalah bukti yang cukup jelas bagaimana penghapusan etnik itu dilakukan di pelbagai peringkat. Bukan sahaja rumah yang dimusnahkan dan dibom, tapi dalam masa yang sama segala aspek kehidupan seorang insan itu dinafikan secara jelas di Gaza, dan inilah yang dinamakan sebagai genosid ataupun penghapusan etnik secara jelas dan secara nyata pada hari ini.
Yes, exactly. So the destruction of homes, when the homes are destroyed individually, that is, one home is destroyed after another as part of a military operation, that is already a war crime under the Geneva Convention, because homes are protected objects under the Geneva Conventions. So every military commander must exercise due diligence and must decide whether it is worth destroying a home in order to achieve a military objective or not. and therefore has to think about proportionality and necessity, all those rules of humanitarian law. But what I'm talking about is basically the utter destruction of the entire life of a people, which involves destruction of entire cities and neighborhoods, of livelihood sources, the destruction of water sources, for example, the destruction of agricultural fields, and making resumption of life impossible for the community. And that has a very different consequence, and it also may have a different motivation. So in the case of Israel, for example, and the destruction of homes in Palestine, for example, it is quite clear that, especially when you consider the destruction of homes together with these public statements from Israeli leaders, that the intention is genocidal. They intend to eradicate Palestinians as a people, in whole or in part, and the goal being annexation of the territory in order to make it as part of Greater Israel. And that to me is actually a fundamentally different nature of, it's a different crime from simply demolishing one or two homes. It's elimination of a whole people. In fact, that's exactly the argument that South Africa made in its submission before the International Court of Justice. It said that Article 2, Paragraph C of the Genocide Convention is violated because life has been made unsustainable in Gaza.
Adakah masih ada masa depan untuk penduduk di Gaza untuk tempoh 3 hingga 6 bulan akan datang? Ini jawapan beliau.
Well, what we are immediately seeing, and what I'm really most concerned about, is the fate of about 400,000 Gazans north of the Netzarim corridor in the northern parts of Gaza. They are under siege. No food or water has been allowed to go in since October 1st. Winter is approaching. They have very, very serious needs of shelter. There is a very credible report of starvation happening in the north. And we have a real serious threat of mass extermination of 400,000 people in the north. So the ceasefire that we need right now is quite obvious, and we need immediate emergency assistance to the people in the north.
Tidak cukup di Gaza, Israel dan juga tentera Zionis juga melakukan perkara yang boleh dikatakan hampir sama seperti di Lebanon. Tapi dalam masa yang sama, Profesor Balakrishnan menyatakan bahawa apa yang berlaku di Gaza pada kali ini cukup berbeza dengan kawasan konflik yang lain jika dibandingkan dengan Ukraine maupun Lebanon, kerana kata Prof Balakrishnan, Gaza itu sendiri adalah penjara ataupun kurungan terbesar di dunia, dan penduduk Gaza tidak ada harapan ataupun cara untuk keluar daripada kawasan konflik. Itu perbandingan yang paling besar jika dilakukan ataupun jika yang membezakan Gaza dengan kawasan-kawasan konflik yang lain.
What we've seen in Gaza is actually many times worse than what we saw in Iraq in the 2000s, and also, of course, what we have seen in Syria. Because there is a basic difference between Gaza and those countries, or even, say, Ukraine. When these places were bombed, the people in those places could actually flee far away, including migrate out of their country and escape to other countries as refugees. That is not the case with the Palestinians in Gaza. They run around in circles within the very small territory called the Gaza Strip. And while they're being shot at and bombed, they keep running around. They go from north to south, south to north, but they cannot escape because the borders are all closed. They cannot come into neighboring countries. And so there is a fundamental difference between Gaza and those countries. And also I want to say the level and scale of destruction in Gaza is actually far worse than what we have seen even in Syria and Iraq or in Ukraine, for example.
Bagaimanakah impak peralihan kuasa kepimpinan di Amerika Syarikat apabila Presiden Trump memenangi pilihan raya presiden baru-baru ini? Bagaimanakah ianya mengubah polisi Amerika Syarikat? Namun, Prof. Balakrishnan memberi pandangan bahawa bertukar kerajaan ataupun bertukar pemimpin sebagaimanapun, tapi hak yang paling asas ataupun hal yang paling sekali fundamental dalam hal ini ialah isu menegakkan keadilan, dan itu perlu didukung oleh semua pihak.
Well, I want to say that governments can have, the governments of countries can change, but the countries continue to have the same international legal obligations. Just because a new government gets elected doesn't change the fact that the international legal obligations of the country also change. With regard to the United States, that means that no matter who is in power, whether the Democrats or the Republicans are in power, the country still needs to abide by international law. And this is also quite clear from the decision of the International Court of Justice. And I'm just going to simply say that the supply of weapons to enable the commission of this genocide in Gaza has already implicated the United States in very serious and grave crimes under international law, and that is before the election. Subsequent to the election now, the first thing I hope the new government would do is to stop the supply of weapons.
Are you quite optimistic about that?
I am not optimistic or pessimistic about anything, but these are the obligations under international law, and I expect the new government to fulfill its obligations under international law, and also to make sure that it responds by providing humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza.
Dalam hal lain, kita bertanyakan bagaimana untuk kita memahami konsep hak asasi manusia dan pemilikan rumah secara jelas, dan ini asas yang perlu difahami oleh semua menurut wakil khas PBB ini.
Yes, of course. Housing as a human right is the basic sort of meaning of housing as a human right is that every human being is entitled to live in peace, security and safety and dignity in their own home and in community with others. That is basically the definition of right to adequate housing. That also means that it goes way beyond simply housing being four walls and a roof. It also means that the loss of a home should not be treated as simply a monetary loss. For example, should not be treated as a loss of property, but so that the issue doesn't boil down to simply whether we can compensate an individual who has lost a home, but it should be seen for all the material and non-material losses, and including emotional and psychological losses that people have, and that many of those are not even compensable. So I hope that this understanding of human right to adequate housing is fully taken on board by all states and other actors. I would also add that the human right to adequate housing also has specific elements to it. So, for example, security of tenure is an important consideration, meaning you have a right to stay in your home and not be evicted on unreasonable grounds. And you have the right to have access to affordable housing. That housing should not be unaffordable. And you have a right to a housing that is adequate, meaning that it is livable and habitable against cold and heat and other elements. And it is connected to services, including adequate water and sanitation and electricity. And it is located in the right place so that you can have access to your livelihood and your jobs and other needs of life. And it must be culturally appropriate as well. These are elements of the right to adequate housing which are defined by the human rights, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights under the International Covenant.
Mungkin memiliki rumah sudah cukup untuk memenuhi hak asasi seorang manusia, tapi itu sebenarnya tidak lagi memenuhi kriteria itu, kerana banyak perkara dan juga permasalahan yang berlaku dalam konsep pemilikan rumah ialah mereka dibebani hutang ataupun kualiti perumahan yang belum cukup lagi baik. Jadi bagaimana peranan kerajaan untuk mengimbangi antara keuntungan korporat atau keuntungan pemaju dan juga keperluan dan juga peranan yang diperlukan oleh kerajaan? Ini jawapan beliau.
Yes, homes need to be affordable, and increasingly, especially in the light of the global economic crisis that we've been seeing since for many years, since 2008, given the global financial crisis, but also more specifically since the outbreak of COVID and the rise in inflation due to rising commodity prices that we've seen. The people in most countries are finding it more and more unaffordable to be able to buy and rent homes, and they also find that when they miss a payment or two, they also stand at great risk of getting evicted from their homes, and homelessness is rising as a result. Too many people end up on the street, and because too many people end up on the street, governments are also getting tempted to criminalize them, to send them to jail. And this is a very critical issue on which I have submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council saying that criminalization of homelessness must be avoided by states. They must get to addressing the root causes of homelessness, which includes addressing the global affordable housing crisis. If you make housing affordable, there is no need why people would get homeless, at least not in so many numbers.
But how the role of the government to balance between the perhaps profit and dollar to the needs of the real affordable housing?
Well, I understand the role of the government to be one that works for the welfare of its people. And if that is the case, there should be no contradiction between the economic strategy of a government that pursues growth from using that growth or pursuing the growth in such a way that it never conflicts with the ability of its people to fully exercise their human rights, including the right to adequate housing. So a growth is to be achieved at any cost. If that is actually the approach that governments have when it comes to fulfilling the economic development strategies, then they're going to end up sacrificing the rights of their own citizens to achieving that very limited and artificial goal.
Kami tanyakan juga kepada Prof. Balakrishnan bagaimanakah pandangan beliau mengenai projek perumahan dan juga isu perumahan di Malaysia. Meskipun tidak mengkajinya secara lebih mendalam, tapi ini sedikit sebanyak pandangan umum beliau mengenai apa yang berlaku di Malaysia.
I've not conducted an official visit to Malaysia in my UN capacity, and therefore I'm not able to officially say anything. But I do know that in many cities in Malaysia, including Penang, there is a grave affordable housing crisis. The cost of property and land has increased quite dramatically. Cost of housing is exceptionally difficult, especially for middle and low income communities. But I also know that Malaysian government has many proactive programs in place to cater to those individuals. I do say that in terms of treating housing as a human right itself, including providing remedies for Malaysian citizens to approach the courts, there I believe that some additional steps can be taken to improve the situation further. But in terms of the government efforts to provide programmatic interventions, I believe Malaysia is actually doing a lot.
Itu dia sikit sebanyak temu bual kami bersama dengan Wakil khas PBB mengenai perumahan yang sempurna dan juga adil ini, iaitu Profesor Balakrishnan Rajagopal. Tapi dalam masa sama ini membawa ke perspektif yang lebih luas bahawa isu perumahan, isu penempatan merentasi pelbagai hal-hal yang lain, daripada krisis dan juga konflik ataupun kehilangan tempat tinggal seperti apa yang berlaku di kawasan-kawasan konflik di Gaza, sehinggalah ke Ukraine dan juga Syria, hinggalah kepada pemilikan rumah bagi negara yang sedang bangun seperti Malaysia. Harapnya ini dapat membawakan dan juga memberi manfaat kepada anda yang menonton. Sekian sahaja perincian dan juga perkongsian kami bawakan dari World Urban Forum ke-12 di Kaherah ini.